Hello and welcome to News Desk. I am Melissa Chan.
And I'm Jared Reed.
We are going to talk about USAID. It's an organization that most people don't pay much attention to until Elon Musk set his sights on it at the start of Donald Trump's presidency. Now it's become a flashpoint. Take a listen.
When you look at USAID, that's a fraud. The whole thing is a fraud.
It is the lead development agency in the world, and no one elected Elon Musk to dismantle it.
USAID has a history of sort of ignoring that and deciding that there's somehow a global charity separate from the national interest. These are taxpayer dollars.
Elon Musk's effort to dismantle the Agency for International Development is a gift to China. It's a gift to Russia.
So Trump says it's a fraud. Others say it is a bulwark against China and Russia. So which is it?
Well, Melissa, let's just start with some basic facts here. USAID was created back in 1961 by then President John F. Kennedy during the Cold War as a way to use foreign assistance to counter Soviet influence overseas. It's obviously moved on and evolved quite a bit since then. More than 60 years later, USAID impacts more than 100 nations, and it's a key source of foreign assistance for struggling countries, as well as being a pillar of what we know as soft power abroad for the United States. Its annual budget is about $40 billion. Now, that really does sound like a lot of money, but it's actually just 0.7% of the total US budget, so less than 1%. Nonetheless, its critics say that's wasteful money, and we're going to explore that a little bit more later on.
So what we're going to do is really go into detail in a way that hopefully helps you understand how USAID works. In other words, Trump's funding freeze and smear campaigns, what's the real cost of cutting USAID? And just full disclosure here, I sit on the advisory board and also the board of two organizations that might be impacted by these cuts. I say might because the bulk of their funding is not from USAID. My board roles have been on LinkedIn for years now, and you can look it up. It's public, and rather than a liability, I hope you see this as me having some insight into the international aid world.
Fair enough. Well, around the table, we've got Amien Essif, who is going to share some interesting things about USAID and misinformation. Welcome to you, Amien.
Thank you.
Across from him is Dustin Hemmerlein. He's going to be monitoring the chat today. Please do send your questions and comments to Dustin, and he'll do his best to make sure we get them and bring them into the chat.
And soon we'll have special guests joining us. Anka Lee, formerly an official at USAID, and then we're very excited to speak later, after that, to Kenneth Roth, former head of Human Rights Watch and just one of the most important human rights advocates in the world.
Exactly. Now, we definitely want your questions and comments. As I said, now we've already had some of them in the community post. I'm going to read some of them out to you. Countries should stand for themselves. Why don't Germany or others try taking the role of USAID and spend what the US is spending? Maybe they'll understand Trump then. To that, I would say Germany does spend money abroad. The main development agency here is called the GIZ. That's the German Agency for International Cooperation. That's owned, if you like, by the German federal government, and it operates in around 130 countries. So perhaps an answer to your question there. Someone else has written, are my taxes going down, presumably a US-based viewer, are my taxes going down since we are saving all this money? And who's going to step into the vacuum from USAID?
That's a really good question, and I guess it depends on what Trump decides to do in terms of his tax proposal. But if you're making more than $800,000, your taxes are likely going to go down based on what Trump intends to do or says he would like to do. If you make less than $800,000 US dollars, it looks like your taxes might go up. So depending on which side of the fence you sit on that, the USAID cuts matter or perhaps don't.
Okay, well, hopefully that's a good enough answer for you. As I say, please do get your questions and comments in, and we'll try and bring them to our guests.
Yeah, and speaking of comments and questions, I mean, we want to ask you questions. Dustin, you have that weekly poll.
Yes, I have a weekly poll ready for you guys. You can find it in the chat right next to the stream. This week's question is, should governments spend less on foreign aid? My Texas answer possibility number 1 is my Texas should be used for me. Answer number 2, only defund political groups. Answer number 3, foreign aid expands our influence. And answer number 4, Trump and Musk, they just want attention. Let us know what you think. We'll revisit this later and get everyone's opinions on your opinions. And yeah, I'm excited for this discussion.
And always as a caveat, not a scientific poll. We know that. It's just a way to get you guys involved. And then to actually involve Amien, because you've been very politely waiting to get to you. I know you've been spending quite a bit of time looking at disinformation, because there is tons of disinformation about this. Can you run us through some of the stuff you found?
Yeah, anyone who's been on X, formerly known as Twitter, in the past few weeks would know that there's just a barrage of information about claims about what USAID has been doing, what DOGE has found, that's Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, where the money was going. It's just really an onslaught of claims over and over and over again about coming from being retweeted by Elon Musk and people who are supporting this initiative to basically downsize the government. The hard part is that some of it is backed up by some truth. Some of it is true,
right? Yeah.
But it's mixed in with a lot of claims that are just so wildly false that it staggers the imagination how they even came up with this. I'll just start with probably the most prominent one recently, because it was such a flashy thing that Trump and Musk kind of dangled out there. If you can share my screen, what happened was Trump and Musk. First, Musk claimed that 50 million U.S. taxpayer dollars were going to condoms for Gaza. And then Trump did a press conference and said that it was $100 million and that the condoms were going to Hamas. So I don't know if they expected journalists to fact check this. Eventually, the hardest part was that where do you start, right? Because when you have a claim that there's no information about, then you have to start from the beginning. Maybe they know something that we don't know. There have been other claims that have exposed things that USAID was doing that weren't very common knowledge. But this one, it seems, after journalists dug in for a while, it seems it came from a program that was actually funded by the USAID to deliver contraceptives to Africa. I'll use this, the totality of that program reached 54 million for Africa. So the whole continent was getting 54 million. That may be where they got the 50 million from. The curious thing is where they got Gaza from. Now, somebody pointed out that a lot of this money was going to Mozambique. Don't forget that condoms are not just for sexual promiscuity, but also have a function of stopping the transmission of sexually transmitted diseases like HIV, which is a problem in Mozambique. Somebody figured out maybe it came from this. One of the major provinces in Mozambique is called Gaza, a population of over 1 million people. And it seems that the program was sending about $5 million in the last fiscal year to Gaza, Mozambique, for the purchase of contraceptives. A fraction of that was condoms. So not even 5 million was for condoms. So when you see 5 or 6 tweets a day from Elon Musk making claims about USAID, and the process to figure out where those claims are coming from takes this long, it is very difficult to fact check all of this. Another very prominent one was this that was retweeted by Musk and Donald Trump Jr., which was based on this one tweet that said that over $35 million from USAID was going to Angelina Jolie, Sean Penn, Jean-Claude Van Damme, so basically Hollywood celebrities who were being allegedly paid to go to Ukraine. It's completely false. It was the video that's linked in this tweet is a fabricated video from an actual media organization called E! News, and it just doesn't exist. So this is fake news in the classic sense. Some have speculated that it came originally from Russian propaganda. Don't really know what the origin of that video was, but it's totally false. There is no basis for that claim. One wonders also why Angelina Jolie is a very rich celebrity would need money to go to Ukraine. But
some common sense would help you sort of figure that out, right?
Exactly.
Like think twice about whether celebrities need the money to go.
Right, yeah. But what I'm curious about is why they're doing this, because there are a lot of programs that are very unpopular that they have exposed, especially on the right. There's a lot of money going to LGBT programs around the world. They're spending money on places like Egypt, $6 million to develop transportation and education, and that already is unpopular for a lot of U.S. taxpayers that say they don't want their money going there. But on top of this, you have these wild claims that Gaza is getting $50 million for condoms, which turn out to be completely false. So yeah, it does feel like a part of the strategy is flooding the zone with information as well as policies to...
Are these legit programs still being reported, or not to the extent that the unlegit programs, the false ones are? Like, what's the sort of balance between the real programs and the ones that
is a really
not?
good question. It took me a long time to find an example of one thing that was true, that wasn't exaggerated in some way. Now, part of that is because a lot of people who are supporting this initiative exaggerated to appeal to people. You had Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, claiming that something was 100 million when it was really 500,000, things like this. But I think it also is a question of the media. I mean, the media, like when we see a claim and we fact check it and it turns out to be wildly false, then we're going to focus more on that. So maybe 10 years ago, this would have been a terrible strategy. But now it seems to be working. I think a lot of his supporters don't mind that half of it is false when half of it is true. It creates a narrative that this organization was spending so much money on these ridiculous programs.
Yeah, and as Mark Twain says, the lie travels halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to tie its shoelaces, right? That's something.
Funny enough, Musk actually did somewhat apologize. His Twitter personality is so much more radical than his in-person personality is. We have a clip of that where he did say he doesn't always get it right. If we can play that now.
Some of the things that I say will be incorrect and should be corrected. So nobody's going to bat 1,000. I mean, we will make mistakes, but we'll act quickly to correct any mistakes. But if it went to Mozambique instead of Gaza, I'm like, okay, that's not as bad, but still, why are we doing that?
But the question there is why. I mean, okay, he's not. He says it's not batting 1,000. Journalists are expected to bat 1,000. If you get something completely wrong, then you might question why you're in that career. But he's acting as an auditor of the federal government. I would assume that you would be 100% correct that something was happening before you slashed it, right?
Absolutely. Well, on that note, let's bring in our first guest, Anka Lee. Anka, thank you so much for joining us. Anka was most recently in the Biden administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for East Asia, and before that was at USAID for 3 years, first as Senior Advisor on China, and then as Deputy Assistant Administrator for Multilateral Affairs and Development Cooperation. That is quite a mouthful. You'll have to tell us what that means. Thank you so much again for joining us, Anka.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And good morning from Washington. Let me just start by saying what my job was when I spent time at USAID. I guess relevant for this conversation was my first job was actually the China strategist and the China policy lead. My job was to figure out how do you become, as an agency, more effective in pushing back against all the things China was doing around the world, using development as a tool. We can talk a bit about that in a little bit. I'm happy to go into specific things we're doing, what we're funding actually on the national security front, so happy to dig deep. But let me just cut to the chase and start very quickly on the headline here, is basically what this administration is doing right now is nothing short of making China great again. The United States government, through USAID, over many, many years, has not only built goodwill around the world, we have developed a great name in showing the affirmative, generous heart of the American people to solve hunger. We all know that. But the other side of it is also from a national security perspective, which is we have done a very good job knowing and figure out exactly what the Chinese are doing overseas and finding ways to strategically push back against that. So what essentially happened by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we have unilaterally disarmed on the national security front. And that's something that's not mentioned nearly enough that I would love to get into with you in a couple of minutes. So happy to answer your questions, dig into how we saw China, what we're most concerned about, and specific things we're hoping to do to be strategic in how we use foreign aid. Because you know what? People are right. This is not a charity. It is a national security tool.
So let's just go right into this. I mean, I guess a lot of people tuning in, some are from the United States, but not all. I mean, it can be interpreted as USAID being fairly nefarious in terms of trying to influence views in other countries on China. I mean, I just want to pick up on that strand. There's a distrust of USAID in quite a number of quarters, especially in the global South, where you hear people talk about American influence rather cynically. So defend the organization, and defend the organization in terms of promoting U.S. national security. Does that mean it promotes international security? What is the argument for other countries to even care about that?
Yeah, our job is to promote international security and international openness, international freedom, and international dignity, essentially, and economic prosperity. Let me just start with the China front, right? You mentioned American influence, but we're also very clear-eyed about what the PRC is doing globally. We were tracking, let me just say, 5 things that I think we were most concerned about in terms of building sustainable and open and free and prosperous societies. I think this is something that both the American people need to understand a little more of, and I think our friends around the world should be. Number one, it's very clear the PRC is undermining the reputation and credibility of the free world and a lot of our allies and partners around the world. They are making the argument that what they do, authoritarian system, it's better, more effective, and do things faster. So work with us. That's number one. Number two, it's very clear the PRC has been exporting and refining technologies to countries around the world. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Building telecom backbone, cable networks, internet systems for partner countries that are prone to privacy violations, surveillance, and control. This is a problem for those of us who care about individual dignity, individual freedom, and the right to exercise your own speech. Number three, we know the PRC is certainly coercing and intervening in a lot of the domestic political conversation in foreign countries. They give aid with something expected in return. So we give you this, but you have to promise us that you're going to be with us on Taiwan. You're going to be with us on Hong Kong. You're going to be with us on the Uyghurs. You're going to be with us on every single China conversation. There is a quid pro quo. So we know that is true. We also know that the PRC has been entrapping a lot of our friendly countries into debt. That's something that's been well written about. And again, we try to think through how we can deal with that. And number four, we know they're shaping international conversations in a way that is more consistent with China's thinking, like elevating economic development over all else, over even human rights, even human dignity. And finally, I'll just say this is an important point. We also know the PRC is using its long arm to reach to silence and stop and shut people up. If you say something about Taiwan that they don't like, if you say something about PRC labor practices in Africa that they don't like, abusing workers, they will silence you. So the question for us at AID is, how do you look out for the interests of our partners that is consistent with what we believe as good governance, and then tailor foreign assistance program in a way to help address that, to make that better, to solve some of these concerns?
Okay, so there's a lot of things that I could touch on, but just very quickly, you talk about surveillance and Chinese surveillance. But look, we're in a period where there's a lot of concern about that in the United States as well. You talk about freedom of expression. There's a lot of concern about what the United States is doing to its own people as well. So I think there's a level of cynicism. So maybe if we can get into detail, could you help us and help everyone understand, give us an example maybe of a specific program? I think we've seen a lot of headlines about HIV/AIDS, medication in Africa, actual food to certain places around the world. But if you can provide one example that is possible on the China front, that might be helpful for people to conceptualize what you're talking about.
Yeah, let me just start with, as an American, let me start with the United States front first. I am proud of my fellow citizens for filing lawsuits, protesting, making sure we're holding our government accountable. This is what a free system does. We are checking our government. We're pushing back. Go to the streets if you want to. I will push my members in this country, members of Congress that is, to have a very robust conversation about what it means to have privacy, what it means to make sure we keep the government in check and surveillance, This is a conversation that every free country needs to be having, and we are having that. And so let me just put it out there. It is what being a free society is about. On the China front, one specific thing, let me give you two. I will tell you that on something closer to home, which is in our own backyard in Latin America, for example, we know that the PRC has been upping its game in these places because why? They need UN votes. Every country has a UN vote because they also want to flip a lot of these countries from supporting Taiwan to China. That's just one of many reasons. We know that a lot of their networks are vulnerable to PRC hacking. So we actually have done a good amount of work in Latin American countries to make sure that they are able to be resilient, to protect themselves. For example, in Jamaica, we have like $3.5 million in helping to train and get the right equipment for government workers to protect their network from cyber attacks. We have strengthened in El Salvador, for example, standards to bid for technology contracts. So to make sure that companies that want to work with them will meet certain high standards, right? And also, we have also done a lot of work programming to make sure that if you want to work with these countries, we have lawyers who work with them and technical specialists work with them to say, ask for these things, so they know how to protect themselves to be a resilient cyber actor. Give you another example. This is more close to the Asia front. We have been pretty successful in keeping Huawei out of the Philippines. We, for example, have a $35 million 5-year project that actually is aimed at helping the Philippines to diversify the use of 5G equipment. So they're not just relying on any one thing. And guess what? The United States is not doing this alone. The Republic of Korea had agreed to work with us to expand this program abroad to other countries, right? How is this not consistent with the vision of the world that we're trying to push? And in our own competition, what the PRC is trying to push. This is what national security protection looks like.
What's interesting is that Elon Musk, while he's trying to promote the cuts to the USAID, is framing it on the one hand as this big charity organization that no U.S. taxpayer should be interested in, just donating condoms to random places, and he's saying that that's not worth it. On the other hand, he's saying also what you have been saying, that it is an arm of U.S. foreign interests, and that he's actually against that. I mean, that's part of the populist appeal of Trump, that he even appeals to elements on the U.S. left, because what he's saying is we're going to shut down these programs that have been largely unpopular among people on the left who said the Cold War is over, we need to stop this, we need to focus on U.S. interest, solve poverty here before we go out and try to influence foreign governments. I'll give you an example. Elon Musk retweeted this guy, Mike Benz. If you can share my screen, he's a former State Department staffer. He's from the right, but he had this tweet where he tweeted out a New York Times article that was actually somebody from the center left, anyway, who was critiquing USAID for basically doing the CIA's job. He mentioned this Office of Transition Initiatives, which he claimed is doing some work of trying to promote regime change in governments such as those in Latin America. And it was controversial in 2014 because of this one program they had. They created a product called Zunzuneo. It's a chat app, basically like Twitter for Cuba. And the idea was they were going to create this app clandestinely, not say that it was from the US government, try to get as many people onto the app as possible. In the end, they got about 40,000 people before it was exposed by the Associated Press. And the plan, according to leaked documents, was that at some point they were going to start to drop messages on there to try to organize protests against the Cuban government. A lot of Cold War politics in here. And that's something that the left can get on board with and say, hey, why are we doing this around the world? And could also, I would say, this is at least one of the arguments, that it does hurt U.S.'s reputation abroad because it makes it look like it's trying to influence foreign governments instead of helping them. So that, to me, is an example of an interesting example of Elon Musk at least promoting this idea that the U.S. needs to get out of other countries' businesses for our own good.
Yeah, I mean, Anka, I think that's something that I'd love for you to comment on. USAID is not blameless, and there are blemishes to its history in terms of some of the programs that it's decided to pursue. And it goes back to not just the Global South cynicism, but also American cynicism for this program. You just did what I thought was a pretty good job of connecting national security to some of the stuff happening in Latin America and countering China. But that's just me. I think for a lot of voters, they're still not connecting the dots in terms of what USAID does and U.S. national security. And we all know that American voters generally care about the price of eggs and domestic issues. And these big picture stuff is something that's really hard to communicate. What would you say to like what Musk has been saying and people with this kind of populist point of view? Is there something about the messaging that needs to change with this kind of work?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just quickly comment on your colleagues' reporting earlier too. And I think those who are questioning USAID's work just need to maybe like deconfuse some of the messaging, because one cannot be a radical leftist lunatic and a CIA front at the same time. It can't be both. What AID has been doing essentially has been promoting American reputation, certainly our interests overseas, no question about that. Every government does that. The question is, how are you mirroring that with an affirmative agenda that promotes your own interests for the American people, but at the same time is also good for your partner country? Let me give you just one example, and I'll get to your point about domestic interests very quickly. I will give the first Trump administration a lot of credit for coming with this idea. In 2018, the White House did a wonderful program called Prosper Africa. Now, this is a way for me to answer your question about, hold on a second, it's just about U.S. national security, or it's really about the good and interests of our partners? Well, this is actually the latter, the second one, for the good. Prosper Africa was a great program. Again, Trump launched this in 2018. The goal was to essentially build a middle class in Africa. The goal was to empower youth employment. The goal was to enhance American companies' access to Africa. Again, you're checking all the boxes here. And it was a interagency, and when I say that, it's a really nerdy word. It means every agency in the government is involved in this. Every agency, Commerce, State, USAID especially. Our unique role in this program was to bring together special experts, business know-hows, people who can help African small businesses to grow to scale the business, to export, basically to achieve prosperity. And I'll tell you, since 2018, this is what this program has done through a lot of effort through USAID, right? It has resulted in about $1.5 billion in closed, finalized deals. It has, involved at least $1 billion in finalized investments. You're talking about enhancing trade between the United States and Africa, empowering the economies of both continents. You're talking about facilitating more access for American companies, people, which in turn will create jobs at home, which is also good for Africa. It is also making African countries much more resilient, meaning independent. They can stand on their own. They can be prosperous. They can share in the dream. This was a Trump administration program launched in 2018 during the first term. So what changed? And I think that's something, the nexus here. And by the way, the work that we do overseas, I talk a lot about national security, the first half of it, but let me spend some time about things you already know a lot about: Africa, HIV, food feeding the hungry. Guess where that stuff's coming from? The United States government is purchasing hundreds of millions of dollars of surplus wheat and corn and agricultural products, and we then ship them overseas. Guess where the income is going to? American farmers, especially in the Midwestern states. You know, we feed young kids who are not just malnutrition, but also hungry, but not just hungry, but are wasting. Wasting means you're close to death. With a special kind of paste that will really bring the young kid back to life very quickly. Some of these come from peanut farms in Georgia. And the United States government buy that in order to make this happen. And let me give you just one final comment here, which is, listen, I've worked in state and local government in the United States. I have not spent my entire career doing foreign policy. I'm a first-generation college graduate. Can barely read until I was 18 years old. I understand why this is hard to believe. But let me tell you this too, is that in this world, and people like Elon Musk and people like Donald Trump, they know this because they are in international business. They have interests around the world. Elon Musk's business is global. And that's not a bad thing. But it also means that the more you're able to create the world that is stable, the more that you're able to create a world and country partners that can actually buy your stuff, the more that you're able to create a world where other countries can actually work with you economically,
right,
it makes you richer in the end. And so foreign aid is not a cure-all. By the way, we need a lot of reform. Making it more efficient, please do that. But to say that I'm going to drop and throw it out right now,
yeah,
you are disarming and you're not helping.
Anka Lee, thank you so much for joining us. We have to leave it there, but I think that the last half hour has been incredibly productive. So really appreciate that you could join us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, and have a good afternoon.
Wow.
Yeah, Jared, just very quickly, and then we will introduce Kenneth Roth, but any comments or anything from the stream?
Yeah, it's quite a lively stream today. Thank you so much, everyone, for weighing in. I'll just read a couple of the comments out. Someone's written, US taxpayers have no obligation paying the money for many nations' problems overseas. Anka was just mentioning that that USAID isn't, the programs that it funds isn't a cure-all. I think that's what he said. And you were talking about blemishes as well. Melissa DeVos has written, every person, every country, every government, every program has blemishes, but we learn and improve and push for more transparency. Thank you very much to the people that have been weighing in, and please do continue to write your questions and comments here.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now, thank you very much for the patience of Kenneth Roth, but he is joining us, and he's the former executive director of Human Rights Watch and is currently a visiting professor at Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. He is also author of a new book, Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments. And as I mentioned earlier, he's one of the most important human rights advocates in the world. We are very glad to have you join us. Ken.
Great to be with you, Melissa. Hi.
Hi. So I want to ask, I've had one human rights specialist describe what's happened over the last 2 weeks as the complete destruction of the global human rights ecosystem. Would you agree with that assessment in terms of stuff like cutting off USAID?
Well, first, I mean, if you're talking about what would Trump like to do, that may be an accurate assessment. If you talk about what the actual effect is, no, that's a complete exaggeration. And, we can get back to that. But we saw, much of this during Trump's first term. The global human rights system did not collapse. Indeed, it was remarkable how other governments stepped in and picked up their responsibilities. This is a tougher world. If I think back then, 4+ years ago, Angela Merkel was German chancellor. She had real stature. Emmanuel Macron was, a much more powerful, heading a much more wholesome government, not a divided government as he is right now. So, the world is different, but I wouldn't exaggerate. There are ways in which the global human rights system can be sustained. As for USAID, you just heard, a lot about what it does. And, the basics, of course, is, it provides, education and healthcare, and, really it serves people's basic needs, which, are issues of human rights. But, it also, and maybe this is lesser known, but it promotes what autocrats hate. Autocrats obviously are not happy with the goodwill that's generated by providing for people's basic needs around the world. But more directly, USAID funds human rights programs, pro-democracy programs, independent journalism, which in many countries can't really exist without external support. The idea, in an autocracy of waiting for local advertisers to support your journalism, there's no way, because if you have a major business, you're terrified that the autocrat is going to penalize you if you're seen as supporting independent journalism. So the only way to for this to exist is with external support. And USAID was a very important resource for these kinds of checks on autocracies. And so, I could just imagine, Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, they're salivating at the thought that this important force for human rights, democracy, and global betterment is in the process of being sabotaged by Trump. What could be better for their effort to undermine U.S. soft power and to promote their authoritarian rule?
One statistic that I've seen over the last few days is that the U.S. provides 40% of the world's humanitarian aid. It's a little bit tricky because humanitarian aid is slightly in a different bucket than what you just talked about. But at its essence, if you take the U.S. out of the picture, it basically collapses any global system, whether it's the human rights ecosystem. You said it's a bit of a maybe exaggeration to say collapse, but impacting massively then the budgets of a lot of these NGOs. And that doesn't seem to be a good setup where we have a situation where so much of the world's global public health or the world's human rights activity depends on one country. It's a vulnerability that I think a lot of people in the NGO world has been acknowledging for a long time. So two questions. Where you say that it's been good that other countries have stepped in here, but is this model is this time for a rethink of the model when one country has such a massive influence on so many other NGOs around the world when they make a decision like this? This isn't a working model. Where are the other democracies, for example? If every democratic organization, pro-democracy organization, a human rights organization I've talked to in the last 2 weeks is basically having to lay off people, saying that they might not exist in a year. That's where things stand for a lot of places, and some of them will survive, but it just doesn't seem like it's a sensible system.
Well, Melissa, let me just put a bit of a caveat there, because the two biggest global human rights groups, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, don't take 1 penny of U.S. government money. Indeed, we don't take any government money from any government. And that's for precisely this reason. You can't trust governments. Governments become very politicized. Even Canada, which was an important source of human rights funding for many organizations, stopped funding groups that criticized Israel. So, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty both felt that it was stronger to depend solely on private funding. And that's what we do. Now, we also are in a bit of a privileged position because we've developed that network. And so, it's not easy overnight to find private donors. But this is, an alternative model that is out there. Now, in terms of, many groups do rely on governments. It's not just the U.S. government. The U.S. government maybe plays a dominant role, for example, with the groups that monitor human rights in North Korea. They are overwhelmingly dependent on the U.S. government. There were certain things that the Biden administration was interested in, for example, monitoring war crimes in Ukraine. This is not an interest of Trump. So there are certain groups that are going to be hurting right now. But we shouldn't pretend that it's only the United States. The European Union, Canada, Britain, Norway, these have all been important funders of human rights and pro-democracy efforts, which will continue. Now, obviously, they can't completely fill the gap left by the United States. And it's not just non-governmental organizations that are at stake. The World Health Organization is lost basically it's 20% of its assessed funding and more in terms of voluntary funding. Now, there is a certain shoot yourself in the foot quality to this because, if you think about, what does the WHO address? Well, infectious diseases for one. And if you're polio or Ebola or, the next generation of COVID or the next generation of bird flu, Trump may be a xenophobe, but that's not going to stop the germs from crossing the border. And for Trump to say, oh, the CDC, the American Health Organization, can't speak to WHO. We're going to just pretend WHO doesn't exist. It's as if you're taking, this huge, important country, with 300 million people and saying, sorry, you're going to be defenseless in the face of the next infectious disease. So, there are certain elements of this which are just pure ideology. They're not serving the American people. Will the pressure come back enough on Trump to try to adjust some of this? Who knows? But there is, this is just, his, I think warped vision of America first. It's bad enough that here you have, the world's biggest economy, an incredibly wealthy country, and to pretend that it owes nothing to the rest of the world. And, it would be one thing if you said, oh, well, we're going to take this money and, build up health care for the poorest people, what's known as Medicaid in the United States. That's not going to happen. They're trying to attack Medicaid. Where this money is going to go is to continue the tax cuts for the wealthy that Trump pushed through in his first term and now needs to continue. So, this idea that, oh, we're looking out for America first, no, we're working out for Trump's cronies first. So I think that there will be pushback on this from the American public. But, for the time being, yes, damage is being done. No question about it.
I mean, that makes me wonder that you said that a lot of autocrats hate U.S. aid because it promotes U.S. values. And that's obviously something that the Republicans have always been interested in. A lot of Republicans supporting Trump, a lot of people who elected Trump are interested in promoting U.S. values around the world. They do like the fact that Putin and Xi don't like when U.S. intervenes in some places. So that makes me wonder, are there programs from USAID that you would say are really just charity, if I can use that word, are really just there to help people and not to promote U.S. values or to promote U.S. interests?
Well, I mean, I think as you heard from your prior guest, they're, helping poor people around the world is not, kind of a narrow self-interested thing, but it does promote America's goodwill around the world. They're also, if Trump is worried about immigration, making sure that people are not starving to death is something that, will enable people to stay in place rather than have to, out of desperation, travel. So, these are complex matters. And yes, there's some just charitable benevolence to it. There's a lot of self-interest in it as well. But, frankly, a wealthy government like the United States should be helping people around the world. And, as an American, I just, it's shameful that, here there's a president who doesn't recognize this. Now, the Republican Party 5 minutes ago did recognize the importance of this, but, the Republicans have become the Trumpicans. And they've just, kind of lost their independent voice. They're all terrified that Trump will turn on them and, they'll have a primary challenge and lose their seat. And so the party that is now, by a slight margin dominating the Senate and the House has disappeared. They're not an independent check on the executive. And, the Democrats are trying to figure out what to do in their minority status. I think, the media has been doing a good job of pointing this out. Civil society is still speaking out. These are areas where the courts have, limited power, although, even a court has tried to stop Trump's decimation of USAID, and that, may still be an impediment to his plans. But, it is a very narrow view of what America's self-interest is.
I want to stop in and check in with Jared over there in terms of any comments from people who are tuning in from the YouTube stream.
Yeah, Ken, it's Jared Reed here. Thank you so much for your time. We've had one comment from a user here. It's saying, he's basically saying, let's give this drama a bit of time and we'll see what the negative impacts are, say, in the short to long term. If we're looking short term, what would you say some of those immediate negative impacts would be, not just, I guess, in the countries affected by these cuts, but possibly at home as well? You were talking about a domestic audience a little bit earlier.
Well, I am not recommending just waiting and hoping things work out. I mean, I think these have to be actively opposed now. But I do think that the political tides will turn, and that, as people begin to see the consequences of this, when it's just, starving children in Sudan, or, further devastation in Haiti, which is a major source of migrants. I don't think the American people are happy with that. They may be less aware of how this is decimating the checks on autocracy around the world. So if you have, independent media folding, if you have human rights groups that are no longer able to operate, that may not be as quickly apparent to the American public. But believe me, the autocrats of the world will like this. Now, Trump obviously has a soft spot for autocrats because, he envies them. They get to operate without checks and balances. They don't have to worry about an independent Congress or an independent media or, independent courts blocking their efforts to do whatever they want for themselves and their cronies. So, I don't think we can look to Trump to sort of change his views on this. He's always had a place in his heart for autocrats. He'd like to be one himself. But I do think, the American public appreciates democracy around the world, and we'll, have to see if the devastating consequences of this will become apparent and change the political tides in the U.S. over time.
I want to actually run a couple of sound bites right now from the critics of U.S. AID and U.S. foreign aid in general, but with caveat that the first voice you're going to hear is going to be from Maria Zakharova from the press spokesperson from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, and then Viktor Orban, Hungarian Prime Minister. Let's just have a listen to what they say, and then I have a follow-up question.
It is an intervention machine in internal affairs. It is a mechanism for, changing regimes, political systems. It's like some kind of Terminator, but it is definitely not a helper. It is outside both Russian and international law.
All money coming from America should be made public, and those who receive it should have sanctions enacted against them. You cannot accept money from abroad in order to influence Hungarian politics, and this will be legally enforced.
So one thing that a lot of this I'm hearing from in terms of people who are critical of this kind of aid is that it's not transparent. If you don't mind explaining to people who don't understand what the obligations are for a lot of NGOs in terms of transparency, I think that would be very helpful. But on the other hand, you and I both know that quite a lot of human rights activists in countries where it is extremely authoritarian, whether it's China or Russia, need to operate without transparency to a certain respect. And that, of course, allows these critics to say, well, you're doing this stuff in secret. How do you balance that in terms of explaining to the public that NGOs do have transparency? And if you could talk a little bit about what that transparency looks like, and then balancing it with the human rights need for privacy.
Okay, Melissa, if I could, let me, before I answer your question directly, let me just respond to those two comments because they're just irresistible. I mean, Viktor Orban saying, don't let foreign money influence domestic politics. This is a guy who takes billions of dollars of subsidies from the European Union every single year and spends it on his cronies. He completely uses foreign money to influence domestic politics, but he doesn't want anybody else doing it. Or, the Russian spokeswoman who says, this is interfering in our internal affairs. Well, no, what independent media does is it exposes your corruption. What human rights groups do is try to, hold a government to international standards that in principle Russia is subscribed to, although in practice it flouts every single day. So, these are nice little sound bites to try to, hope that people don't notice the hypocrisy behind them. But these do not, hold water when it comes to rejecting the important role that USAID grantees play. And I should say, they are not about regime change. I don't think anybody has their job of trying to overthrow a government. But, what it demonstrates, and I think it was the Russian woman who talked about this, oligarchs, autocrats exist with secrecy. They hate the idea of their corruption being exposed. That was, Alexei Navalny's great offense. That was why he was arrested and put off in an Arctic prison and died there, because he was brilliant at exposing Putin's corruption. And, there is nothing that gets the public of an autocratic nation more exercised than to see that their leaders who are pretending to serve the people are actually serving their own personal bank accounts and those of their cronies. So, let's recognize what's really happening here. Now, in terms of your question on NGO accountability, again, let's just begin with how organizations, whether it's human rights groups or democracy groups or journalists, how they operate. Because, they don't operate secretly. A journalist operating secretly, what good does that do? Journalists publish what they find. Human rights groups publish their findings. That's how they influence public policy. And so, even leaving aside sources, there's nothing clandestine going on here. These are organizations that sort of by virtue of their mandate are trying to expose what autocrats would prefer to keep hidden. They don't want you knowing about their repression. They don't want you knowing about their corruption. So, there is an inherent transparency to this work. In terms of, how NGOs report their financial sources, there are different obligations depending on the NGO. Human Rights Watch was actually very open about that. But, some organizations, as you note, when they're operating in an autocratic country, they have to be more quiet about their funding sources because they can find themselves in prison. And so, and many NGOs are not even allowed to operate, in the country of their focus. If you're a North Korean human rights activist, you are not operating in Phnom. You're operating wherever you can to try to influence things. Same with China. These days, the same with Russia. They've described basically every human rights group as a so-called undesirable organization, meaning, you can get prosecuted if you work for them. And they've all had to take off for, Tbilisi or Riga or, someplace, in other countries nearby, but not within Russia. So, I think we have to take with a big grain of salt these accusations that this is, non-transparent. These are from the people who epitomize non-transparency to cover up the way they govern.
But there is somewhat of a paradox, though, if you're trying to support press freedom in an authoritarian regime that would shut you down if they knew that you were funded by the U.S., but then not revealing that you're funded by the U.S. is, for anybody who is raised in a place where we do have press freedom, that would be considered non-transparent. You would like to know if, okay, Russia is one example. RT, we know it's funded by Russia and has been shut down in a lot of Western countries because we just don't like the fact that it's funded by the Russian state. But I would also like to know if a magazine was funded by Mexico or something like that. It's just basic to press freedom in an open society that you know who's funding your publications.
I think it's a bit of a conundrum.
Exactly. Yeah.
That autocrats take advantage of.
And I think that's what appeals to a lot of Americans from both sides of the political spectrum. We look at this and say, is it really fair that these media are being propped up by the U.S. government, even if it is for a good cause?
Yeah. Look, I can't speak to these different media organizations. Many of them probably do have transparency policies. I just don't know. But I think we have to recognize that it's not just governments. Even when private organizations are funding these media groups, many countries are trying to say, oh, that's foreign interference, when in fact, really, there is no domestic economic option for independent media. Even a place like Turkey, which many of us think of as having, a vibrant economy and not so many years ago had a vibrant free press. And Erdogan shut it down, partly by arresting journalists, but partly going after the companies, the businesses that own these newspapers and other media outlets and saying, if you don't stop your independent reporting, if you don't become effectively a government mouthpiece, your much larger business interests are going to be harmed. And so, the autocrats have this toolbox and they learn from each other, and they're all kind of using the same tools to prevent independent reporting. So, one way to counter that is for these journalists to seek funds from abroad. The same thing with human rights groups. There are no, Russian donors who could survive very long outside of prison if they were funding, Memorial or the big Russian human rights groups. And so, in these circumstances where there is no domestic freedom, you do the best you can, and you have to look for funds elsewhere.
Right. Ken, before I actually want to pivot a little bit now, and I just want to ask you about your book, actually, and tell us a little bit about it.
Okay, well, thanks, Melissa, for asking. This is a book that I started writing after I left Human Rights Watch 2.5 years ago. And on the one hand, it really draws on my experience running Human Rights Watch for 3 decades. My purpose is really twofold. I mean, one is to show how it's done, because many people support human rights in a kind of nominal way. They say, oh, I think it's a nice thing to do, but you can't get anything done. And what I show is, in fact, you can get a whole lot done. And the organization the book is just filled with examples of impact, of moving, major governments. And this is the second thing I try to do as well. I take on the skeptics who say, oh, this is a pointless exercise. I show that even the toughest governments out there, Russia, Syria, China, have had to respond to human rights pressure that Human Rights Watch and our allies have been able to mount. And the best way of sort of demonstrating this is through stories. And so I tell story after story, kind of pulling the curtain back on the strategies that we used, showing the thinking that we, led us to a certain strategy, but then showing the results. And, you don't always win. I'm not going to pretend it's that simple. And sometimes, the most you can do is maintain the status quo. But even in those circumstances, it's easy to see that the target of the pressure is feeling the heat. So even a country like China, which is hard to move, but, Xi Jinping himself was calling heads of state, trying to fight our effort to get the UN Human Rights Council to put China's repression of Uyghurs on the agenda. And you don't get a head of state doing that if they don't care. And so, I show, for example, even, in Syria, where we went up against Putin and were able to use a combination of exposing his war crimes in Syria, but also generating pressure via France, Germany, Turkey, to force him to stop bombing hospitals and other civilian institutions in Idlib, which is ultimately where this rebel group came from that overthrew the Assad government. So, I hope that people come away from the book recognizing, like, hey, there's something here. We can get things done. And that's the way you go from sort of token engagement to real involvement.
And just to follow up, I wonder if you can tell us what you think is what the human rights organizations around the world as a whole, what they're doing right that you really like these days, and one thing that you really feel like activists need to sort of rethink because the world is changing very fast right now.
Well, I think what we've been talking about, during this show a lot is the global contest between autocracy and democracy. And I think what the human rights movement is doing well is focusing on how this claim of autocrats to be serving the people is a fake claim. They serve themselves. And you take Viktor Orban, who we heard from earlier in the show. He's getting all this money from the European Union, and you go to a Hungarian hospital, and it's decrepit because the money isn't going there. The money is going to build football stadiums so he can pay off his cronies. And so that kind of exposure is very valuable, and that's why the autocrats hate USAID, because they help to fund that kind of effort. I think the real challenge today is more within established democracies. And we've seen that, there is a segment of society in the United States, in Germany, and in many established Western democracies that are souring on democracy. They're turning to the far right. And I think the reason for that is that they feel left behind. They don't feel that democracy is serving them. And that's something that I think needs to be addressed. The people like Trump or like the AfD, have facile solutions, and I think it's useful to point out how, blaming the immigrants or blaming gays or, blaming, the deviation from traditional society, that those are not the answers. That's not going to get people jobs or better healthcare or better education. So you need to puncture that. But we also do need, I think, to pay more attention to building a stronger sense of community. Because, if a Trump can come in and say that, only my kinds of people, basically only, white Americans are within the community, but everybody else is outside and we don't have to worry about their rights. That's the challenge because, the human rights movement is used to saying we need everybody's rights protected for our rights to be protected. And what the autocrats are doing is redefining the community, saying, well, those people's rights, they don't have to be protected because they're not us, they're them. In fact, they're threatening us. And that is an effort to narrow the community. And I think the progressive movement, human rights activists, need, beyond simply articulating what the autocrat is doing wrong, we need to build up a broader sense of community. We need to reinforce the sense of the nation as including everybody. And that's not been a traditional focus, but it's a very important one today.
Ken, thank you very much. We are at the top of the hour. I don't know if you've got a little bit of extra time. Do you have an additional 5 minutes? Okay, great. Because we could end here, but I actually want to check in to see if there's been any additional comments and questions that people, have such a rare opportunity to pose some questions to someone like you, and that you could perhaps enlighten.
Yeah, Ken, look, 2 people in the chat have, and it's not necessarily the most obvious link, but they've brought up climate and climate change when we're talking about USAID. And someone has written here, are Trump's policies designed to avoid taking responsibility for things like the global impacts of US carbon emissions, with the withdrawal from USAID as one example? I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on this particular question if we're sort of looking at climate.
Well, Trump is a complete climate denialist. I'm not sure that you can link that to what he's doing with USAID, although I'm sure it has negative effects. But, Trump just wants to drill, baby, drill, as he puts it. He just feels that, having more oil and more gas is going to, lower the cost of filling your tank and, lower inflation. And that's all he cares about. And it's an incredibly short-term perspective. He just, as you have, these disasters in the United States, this horrible hurricane in North Carolina, these horrible fires in Los Angeles, clearly aggravated by climate change, Trump pretends that it's just not an issue. And so he is, almost out of spite, he is threatening to remove the huge Biden subsidies for electric vehicles, for batteries, for charging networks across the country. He not only is, trying to encourage more use of petroleum, but he's actually, taking a step back from the future. He's kind of ceding this territory to China, which is investing massively in green technology. So, this is a guy who's just living in another world. He pretends not to see the consequences of climate change. And, again, this is where the moribund Republican Party that knows better is just going along. So, I worry because we don't have that much time to really, avoid climate disaster. And Trump is going to aggravate the problem rather than use his next 4 years to try to contribute to the solution.
You say that Trump lives in another world, but for better or worse, we might be living in his world very soon. Kenneth Roth, thank you so much for joining us. Kenneth Roth, international human rights advocate. And looks like we just lost him.
We lost him at the...
Yeah, just the timing. For those in the control room, if you do reconnect with him, please tell him thank you so much. We're very, very grateful. That was just really interesting.
Yes, I can.
Oh, there.
There he is.
There he is.
Thanks a lot, Ken.
Thank you so much if you can hear us. We lost a little bit of connection.
I didn't lose you, but I guess you lost me. So
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us for so long. We're really grateful, and I really look forward to diving into the book.
Okay, my pleasure. Okay, bye-bye.
Dustin, you've been very quiet, but I know you've been busy typing away because I've been looking at you. What are your takeaways from what's happening in chat right now?
Yeah, there was lots going on in chat. So first of all, there were lots of people there expressing that they are concerned that their tax dollars might be wasted. Like what I'm assuming is American or American audience tuning in there. And actually, I would say that might be phrasing it too lightly. They're really angry that like USAID might be wasting money, and that's why we try to put like critical questions to our experts as well, right? Like to ask these questions for you guys. And I think the chat was really at its best when then people from around the world would like mix their opinions in, and then it got really interesting. You know, when you guys have like that kind of exchange in the chat, and we can see like, yeah, like people from all over the world have like all kinds of opinions on this. I feel like that was really exciting, and I learned a lot from that. And I just want to call out some users who were really active, like Kenneth Roller, Charles, Diodota, Nile, and of course Devos and Carolina. Thanks for being there. I think it's really interesting to see the chat discussion develop. Even if there were less questions today, I think it's still pretty helpful, right? Like if we see the experts and you can see all your guys' opinion as well. And it just provides such a good picture of what kind of opinions are out there and what people are like really thinking about USAID.
And one thing, if you didn't join us in the stream at the very beginning, but this was a number that Jared, you shared, right? Which is that USAID money is just 0.7%, less than 1%, 0.7% of the total U.S. budget, and that comes in at about $40 billion. What's very interesting is that President Trump has made clear that he wants to increase U.S. defense spending, which is absolutely massive already. And he's really focused on this 0.7% of USAID, but with defense spending, he might add 1 or 2 percentage points to something that's already a massive fraction of the U.S. budget. So it's all kind of relative in terms of what you're thinking about in terms of cost cutting. And another fact that I had presented earlier, based on Trump's tax proposal that he would like to pass in terms of tax cuts. If you're an American making more than $800,000 a year, you will likely get a tax cut. But if you're making less than $800,000 a year, then your taxes are likely to go up. So again, which side of the fence?
Which is most people, right?
Yeah. I mean, certainly me.
Yeah.
Amien, any thoughts? You had some great questions there, and I know you've done a lot more sort of investigating and research than you could possibly share over the last hour or so.
I think one thing that's important to note is the future of USAID. The narrative that Musk has created is that he threw it into the wood chipper. He actually tweeted that. But it's not totally true. The USAID is going to be probably not have that name anymore, but it's going to be incorporated under the State Department. It was already under the direction of the State Department. I don't know how much of a significant structural change that actually is going to be. And I highly doubt that Trump will have the backing of a lot of Republicans to really cut back on U.S. soft power. I mean, there are a lot of programs that are supported by the very people that give Trump his support. I know that a lot of U.S. taxpayers don't like to spend money on U.S. soft power around the world, but Congress people certainly do, and they do have some control over what the U.S. State Department does. They have to approve its budget. So while Trump can basically flood the zone, as the term has been over the past couple of weeks since he's been in office in his second term, I don't think, I'm curious basically where it's going to end up, because I think there are a lot of programs that were started by Trump that are maybe going to be fished out of the wood chipper, restructured, but in a way that resembles Trump's ideological plan. So I think that my speculation would be, first they're going to dismantle the organization, then they're going to rebuild it in their own image so that it adheres to Trump's different way of using power around the world.
And that's the argument for why they're doing what they're doing. But in the meantime, I mean, one thing that I think people need to think about is that, USAID doles out money to people who apply for grants, right? So if you're a grantee and you get your application approved after you've filled out a very long form, they give you money and it's a contract. You expect a certain amount of money. I don't know the details in terms of whether they get a remittance every month or every quarter. But what he has done is he's essentially kind of, by saying everything's canceled, he has canceled contracts. And right now, as we speak, there are a lot of legal battles over USAID, precisely because there's an argument to be made that a lot of these organizations had the expectation of receiving a certain amount of money based on a written legal contract that has now apparently been broken. And it will be up to the courts to decide, based on how they interpret it, how that's going to actually, like where they actually interpret things, whether Trump had the right to and the authority to or not. And so this is, as you say, really long and drawn out. Anka Lee said earlier that farmers in the Midwest sell wheat to USAID programs that then go overseas. All of that has stopped, which means what happens? Did the farmers ship the wheat and now they're not going to be paid? Or did they grow wheat with the expectation that they're going to sell to USAID and now they have surplus wheat and they don't know what to do with it and they can't sell it anywhere? And so they spent all this money growing a certain amount of wheat and they've lost that money. So that, I see, is another legal case potentially, and all these small little examples. Yeah. And that's why the congressmen have that pressure, because farmers in the Midwest, massive lobbying constituency, right?
Yeah, exactly. I don't think that the story that USAID is gone forever, or that all these programs that they funded are gone now and will never come back. I don't think that's totally true. I can imagine Trump is going to have to do something to appease the people who are actually Americans who are benefiting from it, and also the strategic initiatives that were even started by him and during his last term. I'm sure he's going to want to pivot back to that once the media storm is over. They got the good attention for cutting back on the U.S. budget, but maybe in the future they're going to have to spend a little bit more to get back to things that they like.
And when you talk about appeasement and future, what does that mean? How long could this sort of stretch out for? Well, no,
yeah.
Give us a ballpark. What do you reckon?
The past few weeks have been just this huge just cloud of new policy changes, restructuring. Like Melissa said, it's all going to have to go through the courts at some point. These are contracts. People are going to appeal this. And I don't think anybody knows how long it's going to take for all of these to go through the courts. There might be a Supreme Court decision at some point where they side with him and say, no, you can't make any claims anymore. I mean, they've already sided with him and said a president can't break the law while he's president. So they have a history of siding with Trump. So he might get his way in the end, but I think it's going to be they've started a process now that could take years to unfold.
Interesting.
Yeah, and just on a practical matter, because I think it's helpful. I mean, you say that it's possible to rebuild, but if you have, like, this is my bugbear, the soybean innovation lab has 30 scientists that have been let go because they get their money from USAID and then the money just stopped. So they've had to essentially furlough these people who have been doing such a great research that benefits the soy farmers of the United States, right? Soy innovation, that sounds really dry, but soy goes into soy milk, of course, but it also goes into feed for pigs. Right. So much of this feed goes to the United States, but also around the world for the international pork industry. So there's going to be effects down the line. But meanwhile, you have 30 people who've lost their jobs at this lab, this innovation lab. And how long can they be unemployed for, right? Like, where are they going to be in 6 months? Can you knock on their door in 6 months and say, actually, we're going to rebuild it. We're going to keep the 30 people because actually you guys do matter and it's going to be very helpful for America. I would say not all 30 of them would be there. Some people would have switched to other jobs. And so rebuilding is not a matter of just...
Yeah, but when I say rebuilding, I don't mean the specific programs themselves, but really letting a lot of these programs completely die. Yeah. And the people with them are going to lose their jobs, maybe have to find a new career, but then recreating programs that look like it, that taxpayers may not approve of, but that are recreated in Trump's image. A good example is media. A lot of Ukrainian outlets are funded by the U.S. right now to oppose Russian propaganda. But a lot of those same outlets are people who graduate from European universities. A lot of them are anti-Trump. They don't like the fact that Trump praises Putin, that he's teased the idea of giving Ukrainian territory to Putin in order to make a peace deal. So if a lot of these outlets die, then Trump later could theoretically create new funding for new outlets around the world that are pro-Trump. Because let's be clear, a lot of people who work in the media, that's even media funded by the U.S., are more likely to side with most of, the whole Biden, Obama, even George Bush way of dealing with the world.
To side with democracy as opposed to autocracy.
Exactly. Trump is a huge ideological change, and he knows it's not reflected right now by the money that's being spent on foreign media.
Well, on that note, Dustin, poll
The poll,
results.
Yes. So you guys have voted. Should governments spend less on foreign aid? And the big winner is my taxes should be used for me, say 46% of all people who have voted.
Wow.
After that, on second place, foreign aid expands or influence, 27%. 19% think Trump and Musk just want attention. And only 7% say only defund political groups.
I don't know what to think about that.
Yeah.
You know, usually I'm very nice to our chat audience, but it sounds like you guys are quite selfish people, dare I say.
Yeah. Isn't the taxpayer always selfish, though? I would say that what the argument that our first guest was making was that it is in the taxpayer's interest in the end. It's not that much money. I think that's an argument that wins over some selfish taxpayers. But I think all taxpayers have a right to be selfish.
Only when they connect the dots, and sometimes the dots are really hard to connect, you know, to get there in the end, to convince them, I think. So, yeah.
Jared, any more comments as we've been sort of decompressing?
I think, we had a couple of questions about transparency. So thank you very much to all of that. And I guess lots of ideological questions about what this all means. So thank you, everyone, for your contributions today.
Yeah, we hopefully managed to inform you a little bit more about USAID, more about international humanitarian aid, more about the dynamics of democracies versus autocracies, and how that's playing out in terms of Trump's ideologies and his decisions to try to remake USAID and foreign aid in the U.S. in general. Thanks so much for everyone who joined us. We hope you found Anka Lee and Kenneth Roth interesting.
And we will tell you what our topic is for next week's News Desk on Tuesday, so one day before next week's show. Thank you so much for your time today.
Goodbye.